Every component of government spending that you see right here can be classified into two different categories. They can either be placed in discretionary spending or mandatory spending. So that's where we're going to be going for this particular section. So what are the differences and what are the similarities of each? Let's give you a formal idea of each of them and also a few examples. So here, start off by taking a look at discretionary spending. Discretionary spending. So like the name implies, discretionary spending is exactly that. It is at the government's discretion. They have a little bit of flexibility in choosing what they want to spend their money in these particular categories. It's essentially what Congress has to budget for every single year. So the part of the budget, the part of the government budget, that works its way through the appropriations process, that works its way through the appropriations process of Congress every single year. Of Congress each year. So once again, discretionary spending is the part of the budget that works its way through the appropriations process of Congress every single year. So appropriations just tells us that the Republicans, the Democrats, the Independents, they're all going to come together and basically bicker and fight with one another and then eventually compromise and come up with a budget that is suitable for everyone involved. Essentially, every single year, it's what Congress has to sort of budget for. So simply put, it's what Congress budgets for each year. Budgets for each year. So essentially, there are some congressmen, congresswomen, they want money to go to a particular project. Other congressmen and congresswomen, they want money to go to another particular project. They want to say exactly, I need this X amount of money to go towards this particular category. And then they'll basically compromise, they'll agree, and bam, that's exactly how they come up with a budget. If, however, Congress cannot come to a consensus for a particular budget, that's exactly when the government will go into shutdown. So basically, you've noticed that the government has gone into shutdown a few times in the past few years. And basically, if the government does go into shutdown, the components that are going to be part of discretionary spending, they're not going to be seeing any money diverted towards any of the components there. So here, it's actually a very important part of the budget for government spending because Congress, the government, they do have to come up with a budget every single year, or else the federal government will go into shutdown. The last time that we had some type of big shutdown was just a few years ago. I think in 2017, 2018, the government actually went into shutdown because Congress couldn't actually sort of come to an agreement about funding for a border wall and border patrol. And basically, because they didn't agree to exactly how much money goes to this particular sort of component of discretionary spending, that is exactly where the government did go into shutdown for a few weeks. So what are a few of the examples that fall under discretionary spending? So a few examples. So this is exactly what Congress, these senators, these Congress people, they are going to sort of bicker and fight and then eventually compromise on exactly how much money is going to be diverted towards these categories. So biggest example that we can probably think about is national defense. So we say, hey, we want a lot of money towards national defense. We want to divert a lot of money towards this spending category. And then other people will say, no, we don't want that much money. So in order for us to agree to your budget, you have to give us something in return. So that's exactly how politics is sort of played out. So it can be dirty, it can be clean. But this is exactly how politicians sort of work their magic. National defense falls under discretionary spending. We also see transportation. So a lot of transportation, so roadways, public transportation, it falls under the same category. Also a lot of things like education, science. We can even say the environment. Environment is a big one right here. Environment. Veterans benefits for some strange reason. So veterans benefits. And then we can go ahead and put one last example right here with national parks. National parks. So here, a few good examples of discretionary spending. It's just what Congress has a little bit of flexibility in choosing what they want to spend their money on: national defense, transportation, education, science, environment, veterans benefits, and national parks. And none of these components will actually get any money towards it if Congress actually does shut down, if the federal government does shut down, which is why it's very important for Congress to come to an agreement fairly quickly. So you'll notice that whenever the government goes into shutdown, we notice that the national parks do shut down as well. The workers there don't get paid at all. So it's very, very important. We don't want to see these workers get furloughed. So essentially, discretionary spending is the component of the budget where Congress has to budget for every single year. On the secondary case, on the second side of spending, we have something known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending. So while with discretionary spending, we have a little bit of flexibility in what we want to sort of spend our money on. With mandatory spending, like the name implies, this is going to be dictated by some law that we have to spend money on these particular categories. So spending authorized by permanent laws. By permanent laws. So there's something in the books within the laws in the United States that says, hey, we have to spend this money on these mandatory spending components. And in order to actually change any spending component that falls under mandatory spending, we actually need to change the law. So in order to change, you must change the law. Must change the law. So it's going to be very, very difficult for us to change any component of mandatory spending because in the United States, we actually have to change the law to do so. And basically with the sort of current administration, with the current sort of Congress people, senators that we have, it doesn't really matter who's in power. It just tells us that it's going to be very difficult to come to some type of compromise because politicians, they really don't like one another. And it's very, very difficult to come to some type of compromise. A few examples of mandatory spending. This is where a lot of welfare sort of components do come into play. So things like Social Security. So if we actually want to change the spending component of Social Security, we actually need to change the law. If we want to raise the minimum age, we have to change the law. And of course, that is going to be very, very difficult for us to do with any type of political party. Things like Medicare, we have interest payment on the federal debt. Interest payment on federal debt. And then also, like we said, a few welfare components as well. So things like TANF and then SNAP. So TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. SNAP, supplemental nutritional assistance program. Collectively, they're sort of known as food stamps. So here, these are a few examples of mandatory spending. In order for the government to actually change any of these components, they need to change the law. And even if the government does go into shutdown, we will still be paying these components of mandatory spending. So Social Security recipients will still get their checks. Medicare will still get their sort of assistance as well. You'll still get your food stamps. So here, these are things that the government has to pay no matter what. And with all of this, we have an idea of mandatory spending and discretionary spending, two categories of government spending as a whole. Which one of these do you think makes up a bigger portion of the government budget nowadays? So, as you sort of correctly surmised, mandatory spending is going to be a larger percentage of the government spending nowadays because we do notice people are getting older. They rely on the government assistance just a little bit more. So Social Security, Medicare, interest payment on federal debt, these are some of the largest components that we saw in the previous videos. So here, discretionary spending, mandatory spending. Discretionary spending includes these examples that we've already taken a look at. Mandatory spending also includes these categories as well. So here, don't sort of confuse discretionary and mandatory spending, even though they are under the component of just government spending in general. Like we said, mandatory spending is a much bigger portion of our government spending nowadays, worth about 70% of spending compared to 30% of discretionary spending. In the 1970s, it was actually the other way around, where discretionary spending was a larger percentage of the budget compared to mandatory spending. But like we said, just changing demographics and exactly how the U.S. has changed over time has necessitated the need that mandatory spending is much larger than discretionary spending. With this in mind, anytime we talk about fiscal policy just in general, we're actually going to be talking about discretionary spending. So only this 30% of the entire budget. Even though it's a smaller portion of the entire government budget, there is just a little bit more flexibility that comes with discretionary spending. So it's actually very difficult for us to change mandatory spending or any component of mandatory spending. So anytime we deal with fiscal policy, we typically we typically are describing some type of component under discretionary spending. So something to keep in the back of your mind. And discretionary spending is actually a very, very powerful tool to help move the economy along, to influence where the economy may be heading. And there are a few special tools that fall under discretionary spending that we're going to be taking a closer look at. They include government spending, they include taxes, and also something known as transfer payments. But we'll see all of these sort of tied together when we talk about fiscal policy a little bit more in depth. I'll see you guys in the next video.